The North Atlantic stretched endlessly beneath a sky brushed with twilight deep indigo bleeding into soft violet, the last traces of sunset clinging to the western horizon. Onboard Flight 712, a wide-body airliner bound for London from New York, cabin lights dimmed as passengers settled into the rhythm of a long overnight crossing. Blankets were unfolded, headphones slipped on, seatbacks reclined with quiet clicks. Outside, the ocean was a dark mirror, reflecting nothing but stars beginning to blink awake. In seat 28A window, economy class at, a woman no one had paid much attention to during boarding. She was in her late 30s, with shoulder length, brown hair tied back simply, no makeup, wearing dark jeans, and a navy sweater that had seen better days. Her carry-on, a well-worn leather satchel, rested beneath the seat in front of her. Nothing about her stood out. No designer luggage, no loud conversation. Not even a phone screen glowing in the dark. She just sat, hands folded in her lap, gaze fixed on the endless water below. To the flight attendant who offered her a glass of water, she gave a quiet thank you. To the man in 28B who asked if she wanted the armrest, she offered a small, polite shake of her head. She wasn't rude, just private, as if she carried something too heavy to share, yet too sacred to ignore. What no one knew was that this flight wasn't just a trip, it was a promise. Years ago, long before civilian airports and boarding passes she'd stood on the deck of a U.S. Navy aircraft carrier in the middle of this very ocean, wind whipping, salt stinging her eyes, flight suit zipped tight against the cold. Her call sign wasn't on any passenger manifest then. It was stitched in white thread above the left pocket of her gear. Asterisk, asterisk Seabird, asterisk. The first women selected for the Navy's carrier-based helicopter combat search and rescue program trained not to fight, to hover in darkness over hostile waters, to lower a hoist into chaos and pull someone back from the edge. She'd done it more times than she cared to count. Just once someone had done it for her. Now she was flying over those same waters again, not in a Seahawk, not in a flight suit, but in jeans and a sweater, carrying a single folded letter in her satchel. The letter was addressed to a name most had forgotten, Lieutenant Commander Elias Rivera, former rescue swimmer, her friend. The man who dragged her from a downed helicopter after a midnight recovery. A mission went wrong in a storm no forecast had predicted. He hadn't survived the year. A training accident on shore, quiet, sudden, no fanfare. And tonight on the anniversary of his passing, she was flying to Portsmouth, England, where his widow had asked her to speak at a small, private memorial. Just family, just friends. Just those who knew what it meant to trust your life to someone you'd only met over a radio. The cabin hummed with the steady drone of engines. A baby slept in the row ahead. Somewhere, a movie played on a seatback screen, its light muted by the night. Then without warning, the plane gave a slight shudder. Not turbulence. Too smooth for that. More like shift in the air itself. Passengers stirred. A few glanced out the windows. The woman in 28A didn't move, but her breath slowed. Her eyes narrowed, just slightly, because she knew that feeling. It wasn't the plane. It was something else entering their airspace. A moment later, the captain's voice came over the intercom measured, but with that subtle edge only. Pilots and veterans recognize. Ladies and gentlemen, we've just been advised that we'll have a brief escort through a naval operations area. You may see military aircraft nearby. Please remain seated, and there's no cause for concern. No cause for concern. The words were meant to reassure, but to her, they were a key turning in a long locked door. She leaned forward, peering through the window. At first, nothing, just stars. Just ocean, then dash. Two sharp angular shapes emerged from the gloom, slicing through the high-altitude air with silent precision, sleek, powerful, painted in low-visibility gray. FA-18 Super Hornets Navy fighter jets, their twin tails unmistakable. Even in near darkness, they didn't circle, didn't flash lights, didn't roar aggressively. They simply took position, one off the left wing, one off the right, matching the airliner's speed as if they'd been waiting. A child 2 rows back whispered, "Mom," Are those real fighter jets? His mother nodded. Wide-eyed. I think so. Whispers spread. Phones lifted. Cameras clicked. But the woman in 28A just watched. And in that watching, her past rose like a tide. Because she knew why they were here. Not for security. Not for show. For recognition. A crackle faint, almost lost beneath the cabin, noise escaped the cockpit speaker. It's not meant for passengers. But she heard it anyway. Years of training made certain frequencies impossible to ignore? Asterisk. Asterisk. Confirm. Manifest. Is Seabird on board? Asterisk silence. In the captain's voice, low and certain. Affirmative. She's in 28A. The name hit her like a wave. Seabird. She hadn't heard it spoken aloud in over a decade. Not since she'd traded her flight suit for civilian clothes and walked away from the sea, and yet here, over the very waters where she'd once hovered in a storm, lowering a rescue basket into blackness, someone still remembered. The lead Super Hornet rolled gently to the left. Then, with deliberate grace, the pilot raised a gloved hand from the throttle and pressed it to the canopy. A salute, not to the plane, not to the airline, to her. Gasps rippled through the cabin. People turned, searching, eyes landing on 28A. The man in 28B stared at her, bewildered. Who are you? She didn't answer. Just kept her eyes on the jet, her expression can but inside. Something long buried began to surface, because this wasn't coincidence. Elias's widow had written, asterisk, the Navy knows you're coming. They asked if they could honor him by honoring you, asterisk. She'd said yes, but she hadn't expected this. The jets held formation, steady as guardians. Below them, the Atlantic churned in silence. Above, the stars burned cold and constant. She reached into her satchel and pulled out the letter. Not to read it again, she knew every word by heart, but to feel its weight. On the back, Elias had once scribbled, during a quiet moment on deck, asterisk, Seabird doesn't just find the lost, she brings them home. Asterisk, she hadn't felt like a seabird in years. But tonight, the sky remembered, and so did the sea, as the airliner continued eastward. The fighters stayed with them silent, unwavering, a bridge between past and present. Passengers kept glancing her way, not with suspicion, but with something. Closer to awe, as if they sensed they were witnessing something rare, not fame, not power, but respect. The kind earned not in headlines but in darkness. With a hoist cable and a steady hand, she sat back, closed her eyes for just a moment, and let the hum of the engines blend with the memory of rotor blades and ocean wind. She wasn't just a passenger. She was a promise kept, and over the Atlantic where so many had been lost, and so few found she was finally seen. Be sure to subscribe to our channel, Skies of Destiny. The FA-18s held their escort through the night, their presence both surreal and deeply familiar. The passengers, it was a spectacle, something from a movie, unreal and thrilling. But to her, it was a language, silent conversation between those who'd served and those who remembered. Every adjustment in formation, every smooth bank into the wind, spoke of discipline, of respect, a bond forged not in combat, but in the willingness to go back for one another when the odds were against you. She kept her hands folded in her lap, the letter from Elias's widow resting lightly against her thigh. Outside, the Atlantic stretched in all directions, vast, indifferent, and yet, to her, deeply personal. This stretch of ocean had taken lives, but it had also given them back. She'd hovered over these waters in a 60 Seahawk, night after night, searching radar returns for the flicker of a life raft, the glint of a helmet, the faint beep of a survival radio. And once, just once, she'd been the one in the water. A sudden storm, a hydraulic failure, crash that happened faster than thought. She'd surfaced in freezing darkness, treading water, her helmet gone, her radio silent, and in a voice. Over the emergency frequency, calm and steady. Asterisk, Seabird, this is Rescue 1. Hold position. We're coming in hot. Teskit was Elias. He'd jumped into the sea without hesitation. swam through churning waves, and kept her head above water until the hoist came down. She'd never forgotten the look in his eyes as they lifted a weir leaf. Yes. But also something deeper. Asterisk, you're one of us. Always. Asterisk now, years later. His legacy was flying beside her in the form of 2 Navy fighters and a promise she'd almost failed to keep. The captain's voice returned over the intercom, softer this time. Folks, we've been granted clearance to continue with our naval escort through sunrise. They'll stay with us until we cross into civilian airspace near the English Channel. Again, nothing to worry about. Just enjoy the view. Joy. The view, she almost smiled. To most, it was an oddity. To her, it was a homecoming. As dawn began to lighten the eastern horizon, the ocean turned from black to deep blue, then to silver. The stars faded. The jets remained, their silhouettes sharp against the brightening sky. Passengers who dozed off now sat upright, cameras ready, whispering in hushed tones. Some looked at her not with curiosity, but with something quieter. Recognition, perhaps. Or reverence. The man in 28B finally spoke again, his voice low. You were Navy, weren't you? She didn't turn. Just nodded once. A long time ago. You saved lives. Tried to, she said. Mostly I just showed up. That's enough, he replied. And for the rest of the flight? He didn't ask another question. The plane banked slightly, beginning its descent toward Europe. The coast of Ireland appeared on the horizon, green, misty, ancient. The Super Hornets adjusted their formation, staying close, but giving the airliner room to maneuver. Then, as if on cue, both pilots dipped their wings once. Twice in a gesture so deliberate it could only mean one thing. Asterisk, we see you. We honor you. Asterisk, a flight attendant paused near her row, eyes glistening. My brother flies P-8s out of Seganella, she whispered. He told me about you. Said your name's still used in training? What would Seabird do? She looked at the young woman, surprised. I didn't know that. People remember, the attendant said simply. Not the missions, the choices. Those words settled deep, because that was the truth she'd carried all these years. Service wasn't measured in medals or missions. It was measured in moments when you chose to stay, to return, to hold the line even when no one was watching. As the plane crossed into UK airspace, the lead FA-18 peeled off, followed by its wingman. They climbed sharply, then circled once. Overhead before vanishing into the morning sky. Not with a roar, but with grace. The cabin exhaled, but she didn't look away until they were gone. When the seatbelt sign chimed off, the leather satchel, the letter, the quiet weight of memory, she stood as the crowd began to shuffle toward the exits. Letting others pass first, was always the last to leave, always the one who lingered. At the jet bridge, a British Airways ground, agents stood waiting, clipboard in hand. But instead of checking tickets, she stepped aside and placed a hand over her heart. The woman in 28A paused. You know who I am? The agent smiled gently. The Navy called ahead.
Elias
Said to expect someone. Special said to tell you. The sea remembers its own. She nodded, throat tight. Thank you. Outside, the London sky was gray and drizzly, classic English morning. She walked through the terminal not as a celebrity, not as a hero, but as a woman carrying a promise. Across an ocean. And yet, something had shifted.
How?
She no longer felt like she was hiding. She felt seen. A black sedan waited at the arrival's curb. No markings. It's just a driver in a dark coat who opened the door without a word. Portsmouth, she asked. Yes, ma'am, he said. The memorial's at 2. The family's already there. She slid into the back seat, the city blurring past the rain-streaked window. Her mind drifted to the small coastal town where Elias had grown up, where he'd proposed to his wife on a pier, where he'd taught his daughter to skip stones, where he'd be remembered not as a sailor, but as a man who believed in coming back for people. She hadn't wanted to speak at the memorial. She'd argued that Elias was the hero, not her. But his widow had written, asterisk, you were his last rescue, and his first friend. Please come. Tell them what he stood for. Asterisk now. As the car wound through English countryside, hedgerows glistening. With rain, she knew she would. Because honoring Elias wasn't about the past. It was about keeping his spirit alive in the way pilots trained, in the way rescuers held the line, in the way strangers still saluted over the Atlantic. The car slowed as they approached the Memorial Garden, a quiet space overlooking the harbor, surrounded by stone walls and blooming rosemary. A small group stood beneath a white canopy. Elias's wife, now silver-haired but strong, his daughter, grown, holding a young boy's hand. A few Navy veterans in dress blues, standing at ease. They turned as she approached. No fanfare, no speeches yet. Just silence. And then, as one, the veterans came to attention and saluted. She stopped, looked at each of them, then returned the salute not as a civilian, but as one of their own. Elias's widow stepped forward, tears in her eyes. "You came." "I promised I would," she said. "You always keep your word," the woman replied, just like he did. They walked together toward the stone plaque bearing Elias's name, rank, in a simple epitaph. Asterisk, he never left anyone behind. Below it, newly engraved, were 3 words, including Seabird. Asterisk, she touched the stone, her fingers tracing the letters. And for the first time in years, she let herself feel it, not the guilt of surviving, but the grace of being remembered. This wasn't closure, it was connection. And in a world that often celebrates noise, this quiet moment in a rainy English afternoon, surrounded by those who understood, was enough. If you liked the video, be sure to like it. Be sure to write your opinion in the comments at the end of the video. Rain fell softly over Portsmouth Harbor, dotting the surface of the water with tiny ripples that spread and vanished like forgotten moments. The Memorial Garden stood quiet now, the small crowd having dispersed after the brief service. Only she remained, seated on a weathered wooden bench beneath a stone archway draped in ivy. Before her, the sea stretched toward the horizon, the same sea that had once tried to take her, and the same sea that had brought her back. Elias's daughter approached slowly, holding the hand of her young son. The boy carried a small paper boat, folded neatly from a page of his grandfather's old logbook, asterisk for Seabird. Asterisk, he said shyly, offering it to her. She took it gently, her fingers brushing the faded ink of flight coordinates and weather. "Notes." "Thank you," she said. "Your grandfather would have liked this." "He talked about you," the boy whispered. "Said you were brave like the seabirds that fly through storms." She looked at him, really looked hand, saw Elias's eyes in his face. It's the same kindness, the same steadiness. It was the brave one, she said. "I just followed his lead." The boy nodded, as if he understood more than his ears suggested. Then he turned and ran back to his mother. Leaving her alone with the paper boat and the sound of waves against the shore, she unfolded it slightly. Just enough to read a single line near the edge. Asterisk day 87. Sea rough. Seabird held station for 3 hours, brought them all home. Asterisk, she folded it again, pressed it to her chest, and closed her eyes. For so long, she'd carried survivor's guilt, like an anchor, believing that living meant she'd failed somehow, that her survival came at the cost of his eventual loss. But sitting here in this harbor, where Elias had learned to sail as a boy, she finally understood. Asterisk, he hadn't saved her so she could disappear. He'd saved her so she could keep showing up. Asterisk, and today she had, not with fanfare, not with uniform or rank, but with presence, with truth, with a promise kept across an ocean and through time. A seagull cried overhead, soaring on the salt-laced wind. She watched it glide effortlessly above the water, just as she once had in a helicopter, scanning, searching, hoping. The sky hadn't changed, the sea hadn't changed, and neither had the calling to serve, to protect, to return for your own. Her flight back to New York wasn't until tomorrow. She had the whole day, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel the need to fill it with distraction. So she walked through the narrow cobbled streets of old Portsmouth, past bookshops, with rain-streaked windows. Along the harbor wall, where fishermen cast lines into the gray water, at a small cafe overlooking the Solent, ordered tea and sat by the window. An elderly man at the next table noticed her quiet gaze and offered a nod. "You're not from here," he said. "Not a question." "No," she replied. "But someone I loved was—" He sipped his coffee. "Then you're where you need to be." She smiled faintly. "Think so?" Later, she visited the historic dockyard, not for the warships or the museums, but for the quiet memorial wall near the water's edge, names of sailors lost at sea. Etched in stone, she didn't look for Elias's name. She already carried it. Instead, she placed the paper boat at the base of the wall, weighted by a smooth, sea-worn stone, a small tribute, private goodbye. As evening approached, the clouds broke just enough to let golden light spill across the harbor. She walked back to her hotel, the sea breeze tugging at her hair. Her phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number, but the signature gave it away. Asterisk Fleet Air Recon, Nass North Island. It read, "Greater than ma'am, your escort pilots wanted. You two know? They trained on your SAR protocols. Said you taught them that rescue isn't a mission. It's a promise. Fly safe, Seabird. The sky's still yours." Asterisk, she didn't reply. She didn't need to. Some bonds didn't require words. That night, she sat on her hotel balcony listening to the tide. Her mind wasn't on the past anymore. It was on the future, on the young pilots learning to hover in storms, on the rescue swimmers jumping into darkness, on the quiet civilians who'd still carry the values of service in their everyday choices. She'd spent years believing her story ended when she left the Navy, but today, she realized it had only just begun, because legacy isn't about staying in uniform. It's about living your values even in silence. Even in C-28A. The next morning, she boarded her return flight with the same quiet dignity she'd arrived with, but something was different. She no longer shrank into herself. She met the eyes of the gate agent. She thanked the flight attendant by name. Even smiled at the child who pointed to the clouds and said, "Look, a bird." And when the plane lifted off, climbing above the English coast, she looked out the window not with sorrow, but with peace. Because the Atlantic wasn't just a place of loss. It was a bridge. She had crossed it. Back in New York, life resumed its rhythm. She returned to her work teaching aviation safety to first responders, volunteering with a coastal surge hand rescue nonprofit, mentoring young women interested in flight careers. She no longer avoided Navy reunions. She even gave a talk at the Naval Aviation Museum, not about heroism, but about listening to radios, to instincts, to the quiet voice that says, asterisk, go back. One more time, asterisk, months later, a package arrived. No return address. Inside, a framed photograph, not of jets or missions, but of the Memorial Garden in Portsmouth, taken on the day she'd spoken. On the back, in elegant script, asterisk, the sea remembers, so do we. Asterisk, she hung it in her office, next to the photo of her and Elias on the carrier deck, helmets off, grinning like they had all the time in the world, and sometimes. When the sky was clear and the wind came from the east, she'd step outside, look up, and swear she could hear the distant echo of Rotersand, a voice saying, asterisk, you're one of us. Always. Asterisk, her story wasn't about fame. It wasn't about war. It was about a promise kept across an ocean, a salute in the sky, a paper boat on the tide, and the quiet truth that asterisk, asterisk, the most extraordinary people often sit unnoticed until the world finally sees what they've carried all along. Asterisk, asterisk, so the next time you're flying over the Atlantic and you see Navy jets flying in silent formation beside your plane, don't just wonder who they're escorting. Wonder who they're honoring, because sometimes the bravest souls don't wear uniforms. They wear quiet. They carry memory. And they never forget the ones who brought them home. And if you ever see her, the woman with calm eyes and a leather satchel, don't ask who she is. Just nod. Like the flight attendant did. Like the veterans did. Like the sky itself does. Because some stories aren't meant to be shouted. They're meant to be lived. And remembered, with respect, with gratitude, and with the quiet understanding that true courage doesn't roar, it shows up and stays. Asterisk, asterisk.